Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Youth Man. I hope you guys are having a fantastic week. I know there's a lot going on in our world today, but hopefully you're able to get some rest, some relaxation, have some downtime, maybe spend some extra time in your home theater while we wait for this whole COVID-19 to blow over. So today I wanted to have kind of a different video, more of a conversation, and the subject is on something being overkill in home theater. Now, in the Facebook groups and different forums that I'm a part of, sometimes somebody will post a picture of their setup or maybe something that they're considering purchasing, and inevitably somebody will comment something to the effect of, that's a bit overkill for that particular setup, or those speakers would be overkill in that room. And so my question today in this conversation is there a such thing as overkill in home theater? And so before we dive into that question and have some conversation here, I want to give a big thanks, number one, to my patrons. You guys have been amazing over the past several months. We've had many, many new patrons. And so thank you for all of your support, for your love, for believing in what I do here on this channel. And if you're not a patron, you can check out the details over at patreon.com/youthman. All right, so as we kind of dive through this, and I just want to share with you my thoughts on this subject. And also, as I'm talking, feel free to leave a comment, a question, maybe a thought on how you think about this subject of being overkill. And so we're going to talk about maybe some different things in a home theater, different components that could be considered overkill. And I'm going to share with you my opinion on those as we kind of go through that. All right, so number one, let's think of maybe amplifiers, okay? Every speaker, a passive speaker, can handle so much wattage, okay? So maybe like the bookshelves, I've got a pair of Klipsch RB61 version 2s over here. And so they handle, I'm guessing, let's just say they handle 150 watts continuous power, maybe like probably 400 watts peak, somewhere around there. Maybe it's 100 watts. I forget the exact number. But would it be overkill if I connected, say, the Emotiva XPA DR3? And so a lot of guys, when they're buying a speaker, you know, I've seen them ask the question, you know, would that receiver be too much? Would it be overkill for my speakers? You know, I've got these little small speakers, they can only handle 100 watts. And let's say the receiver, it claims that it can put out an output maybe 140 watts per channel. Well, the reality is with speakers, you're going to harm your speakers more by underpowering them than by overpowering them. And the other thing that maybe is a misconception with amplification is that, let's say you have a 200 watt by 3 amplifier. And so there's 200 to your front left, 200 to your center, and 200 going to your front right. It's not like you've got 200 watts, you know, just funneling into that speaker at all times. For a lot of speakers, you're never going to come even close to feeding it 200 watts. Now, here's the thing with amplification. It takes twice the power to gain only 3 decibels increase, okay? So let's just take my La Scalas, for example. And I know there's debates whether Klipsch accurately measures their sensitivity, but let's just say, just for sake of argument, they are what they claim to be, which is 104 decibels. And so where that sensitivity rating is and how they get to that is they take a microphone and they place it 1 meter, which is 3 feet from the speaker, and then they feed a signal to that speaker with 1 watt. So we're going 1 watt, measuring it with the microphone from 1 meter, and they just measure simply how loud does it go. And so for the La Scalas at 1 meter with 1 watt, you're going to gain 104 decibels. That's how loud it's going to be at that distance. And so to make that speaker go louder, you have to double the amplification. And so instead of being 1 watt, now we're going to 2 watts. So you take 104 decibels, add 3 to it, so now you're at 104 decibels with 2 watts. And so to get to that next level, which would be 3 more decibels in volume, you would have to double that amplification again. So going from 2 watts to 4 watts, and then 4 watts to 8 watts, 8 watts to 16, 16 to 32. And so you get the idea. So think about this. If you have a 200 watt per channel amplifier, to gain 3 decibels more, you would have to double the amplification. So you would now need a 400 watt per channel amplifier. And so don't get hung up on an amplifier that is 200 watts or 220 watts. You're not going to hear the difference in the 20 watts. And manufacturers, especially with receivers, they kind of play this wattage game, and it's really just a lot of marketing. They figure if they can show you a receiver that has 140 watts versus 120 watts, you'll be more apt to buy it, especially if they're pretty similar in price point. And so like I said, with an amplifier, you're not going to be feeding your speakers the full capacity of that amplifier at all the time. So depending on how loud you listen to it in your setup, like me, most of the time I'm watching movies at about -10 on the receiver. So that's 10 decibels below what we call reference. Reference is just kind of like a standard, pretty much kind of like what you would expect at a movie theater, a movie cinema. And so that's a little loud for me. So to watch an entire movie at reference, that's pretty loud. And so I typically am about -10, sometimes -5 if it's like a really awesome movie. But even sometimes I drop it down to -15. It just really depends on the movie. It depends on how loud I want it that particular night. And so why in the world would you want to feed your speakers more wattage than they can handle? Would that be a benefit, or are you risking destroying them? And so the answer is absolutely. I highly recommend feeding your speakers more wattage than they're rated. And here's why. Let's say you have a receiver. Let's just say forget the amplifier, because a receiver does have an amplifier built into the unit. And so let's say you have a 11 channel receiver, okay? And that receiver is powering 11 speakers. And let's just kind of take B&W, for example. B&W aren't very efficient, okay? They're usually rated about, say, 89 decibels, maybe 90 decibels. Doesn't make it a bad speaker. It just takes a lot of power to get it to get to a certain level. And so let's say you have those 11 speakers and you're playing this big scene and you've got it cranked up to get a certain volume that you want. At some point, that receiver is going to kind of run out of gas. It's giving it all it can. It's trying to carry this massive load of powering 11 speakers that are really low rated as far as sensitivity. And so it's having to tax that amplifier just tremendously and that power supply tremendously. And so once it starts running out of gas, your inclination is to crank it up a little bit more. It's not as loud as you would like it. But by doing that, now you're going to begin to introduce distortion. And even worse, you could introduce clipping. And if you introduce clipping to your amplifier in your receiver or an external amplifier, and it sends that signal to your speakers, you're going to damage your speakers, period. If you're listening to your speakers and they're just not sounding clear, they're starting to sound strained, they're starting to sound kind of distorted, you desperately need to turn your volume down. You're going to destroy your speakers. Having not enough power in an amplifier or in a receiver is going to open up the potential more to damage those speakers than by overpowering them. And so one of the biggest benefits of adding an amplifier isn't to make it louder. Adding an external amplifier, whether you're doing a full like 11 channel amplifier like I've got the Monolith 11X, which feeds my front 3 speakers 200 watts, and then all rest of my 8 speakers, my 2 side surrounds, 2 back surrounds, my 4 Dolby Atmos in ceiling speakers, it feeds them 100 watts per channel. And so by having a dedicated amplifier, it just ensures that you're going to be able to provide clean power without getting into distortion on all of those channels. Now with the receiver, I have been able to effectively power 11 speakers in my theater room. Now granted, this was a $3,000 receiver. This was the Marantz SR8012. And I was able to power all 11 of my speakers, and it sounded fantastic. It was a great, great receiver. It had a big, big power supply, massive toroidal transformer in it, and so it was able to produce a lot of power. But part of that was the fact that I have speakers that are really, really sensitive, and so it doesn't take a lot of power to get them to reference level. And again, if you've got some speakers that are in that 88, 89 decibel, 90 decibel sensitivity, that just means it's going to take a lot more power to get them to that same volume that I would experience here in my theater room. And so having more power just allows you to have what we call headroom. And so headroom, really in just the simplistic terms, is just a reservoir of power when it comes to amplifier. And so you never hit that ceiling. You never max out that amplifier and that power supply. And so it's just always going to sound clean, no matter if you've got it cranked up watching Godzilla, or you're blasting a war movie like Hacksaw Ridge and stuff is flying around and bullets are flying and stuff's blowing up, and you just don't have to worry about your receiver or your amplifier clipping or going into distortion when all of that is taxing your amplifier and your power supply. And so can you have overkill in amplification? Honestly, I don't think so. I think it just allows you to have a lot more headroom and allows that amplifier to play cooler and more efficient. All right, so next let's talk about subwoofers. Subwoofers, as you guys know, I love subwoofers. I love it when you feel the action that's on the screen. If you're watching, again, say a war movie and something blows up, I want to feel that. I don't want to just hear it. I want my body to feel the pressure of that explosion, of that cannon blast, of the tank rumbling. I want to be able to feel like I'm in that movie at that particular time. And having a quality subwoofer or even multiple subwoofers is the key to that experience. So thinking back 13 years ago when I began building my home theater, I only had one subwoofer. At that time, I had a Velodyne, that was the HGS 15. It was a 15-inch subwoofer, and it had, I think it was a 1250 watt continuous amplifier. And I'm like, man, that thing is a beast. That's crazy. 1250 watts, that's amazing. And it was decent. But honestly, that single 15-inch woofer, when I was watching big action movies, it would struggle. It would struggle not only with trying to pressurize this room, but it would also struggle with those really deep notes. And so later on, I purchased a second HGS 15, so I had dual 15s up front. Fast forward down the road a little bit, I had a chance to buy a Klipsch RSW 15 subwoofer. So that now has a 15-inch active on the rear and a 15-inch passive driver on the front. And after demoing it, it had as much output and performance as both of the Velodynes, so I sold those, ended up keeping the RSW 15, liked it so much, found another Youthman deal on one, so I bought a second. Fast forward a couple years later, I found a third, and then I found a fourth. And so at one point, I was running 4 Klipsch RSW 15s in my room. That's a total of 8 15-inch drivers. Now, granted, 4 of those are active, which means those speakers are being pushed and pulled by the amplifier that's built into the subwoofer. And then the passive driver on the opposing side of that is kind of like a push-pull configuration. So as this woofer over here is being pushed by the amplifier, this one over here is passive. And so it's just moving based on the pressure in the cabinet itself. And so they kind of move in conjunction with each other. And so that was great. However, during big scenes, and especially when I was cranking it pretty loud, there were times that those speakers and those subwoofers would kind of struggle. Super low notes, they didn't handle well at all. Anything below 20 hertz, those speakers kind of drop like a rock when you measure them with something like REW. And so I began reviewing content here on the YouTube platform, and I remember reaching out to SVS and said, hey, I've heard great things about your subwoofers, never had a chance to experience them myself. I think it would be great if my audience would be able to kind of see how they compare maybe to my Klipsch subwoofers. They thought it was a great idea, sent me not only one, but they sent me two. So originally they sent me two SB16s, which are the 15.5-inch woofer in a sealed configuration. And that did decent, but it wasn't the best fit for my room and for my taste for home theater. And so I asked them to send me the PB16s. And the dual PB16s had a lot of power, a lot of output, and in fact, it had enough, it basically equated to what I was experiencing with 4 Klipsch RSW15s. And so 2 15s were basically giving as much output, maybe even possibly more in my room than 4 of those Klipsch RSW15s, which has 4 15s that are active and 4 15s that were passive. So that was just blowing my mind that 2 subwoofers could perform that well in my home theater. Those were fantastic subwoofers. I ran those for about 2 years. Lots of output, just amazing impact, lots of tactile bass. But kind of once again, there were times that those speakers struggled. If I watched Edge of Tomorrow, there's no way I could get even really close to reference without those just kind of flopping around. There was a lot of port chuffing at that volume. When you're really cranking those and you've got those really, really deep notes in the beginning of Edge of Tomorrow, the PB16s just can't handle that. And so once again, so here you have 2 15s. You would think, man, Michael, that should be plenty for a room that is 13 foot wide, 19 foot deep, and 10 foot ceilings. And for the most part, they absolutely were. Plenty of output, lots of just bottom end slam, and they sounded fantastic. And then 2 years later, fast forward to probably about 2 months ago, JTR sends me 2 of their new RS2s, which have dual 18-inch drivers in a sealed configuration, and each one of those cabinets has a 4,000 watt continuous amplifier. And so you're looking at this size room going, Michael, could that be overkill in this room? The answer, in my opinion, absolutely not. And again, going back to the same principles I talked about with the amplifier, I think applies to subwoofers as well. And so some people would think, man, wouldn't 418 just sound crazy? Like, wouldn't they just overpower your front sound stage and your surrounds and your Atmos and just ruin the effect? Absolutely, if you don't dial them in. There's no doubt that those subwoofers have more power to really just destroy the quality of sound in this room. And here's what I mean by that. If your bass drivers, if your subwoofer or subwoofers are turned up so loud that they're drawing attention to themselves and that's what you're hearing, and you know exactly, like your ear can go, okay, I know I've got a subwoofer back here because I hear it, then you don't have it dialed in. You've got that subwoofer cranked up so hot that it's overpowering the rest of your speakers. And I've always said this, and I truly believe it, your subwoofers should only be noticed when you turn them off. In other words, you really need to get them dialed in so that they blend in seamlessly with the rest of your system. You don't want them to attract attention to themselves. So when an explosion happens, you just need to feel it. You need to experience it, but you shouldn't be able to go, oh, Michael's got a subwoofer there and he's got a subwoofer there. Or, oh, I've got 2 subwoofers here or 2 subwoofers there. You should just be able to experience it and it's blended seamlessly into your setup. That's a properly dialed in setup. And so can you have too much subwoofer in your room? And again, I don't think you can. And here's the bigger picture, especially with subwoofers. When you have multiple drivers, think about this. If you only have one subwoofer, it's having to work a certain load, okay, to pressurize this room. So if you've got a single inch 15 or a single 15-inch subwoofer, it's doing its best to pressurize your room. Let's say you add a second one. Now that first one isn't having to work as hard to get that same pressure. Let's say you added a third one or a fourth one. Again, you're lowering the volume on each one of those subwoofers so they play cleaner, they play smoother, and they're more efficient, and you're less likely to bottom out or to get into any kind of distortion or that muddiness that sometimes you hear with subwoofers. And so going back to a friend of mine, he has an incredible home theater. He has two 18s in an IB configuration. And there was one time we were watching a movie, it was The Hulk. And it was the scene where they had those big, I don't even know what they're called, but basically those big, they look like big satellite dishes, and they were sending the shock waves, you know, at him, trying to destroy him. And man, when that thing started kicking in, we had it cranked up pretty loud. And all of a sudden, it was doing fine, but then all of a sudden we heard pow, 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 pow. And we were like, I thought his subwoofer, I thought his subwoofer box was cracking. It sounded like wood was cracking. And of course, we examined everything. Everything was fine. And so we backed up that scene and turned it down, but slowly cranked it up a little bit, got to that point and it did it again. And we realized what was happening is to get his subwoofers to that volume and to that pressure in the room, they were literally over-excursion. I don't even know if that's a word. Over-excursion. Basically, they were moving beyond their capability. They were moving too far. The suspension was traveling too far, and it was literally bottoming out, and it was smacking against the bottom. That's not good. That'll damage your subwoofers. Fortunately, his were fine, but what happened is, I think about a year later, he ended up buying two more, and so now he's running 4 18s in his home theater, and he can run that same scene at a whole lot less, not really less volume, because it's still going to be the same volume, but each one of those subwoofers doesn't have to move as far, and they're not going to get to that extreme limits of their capacity, if that makes sense. And so going back to the very initial question of this video, is there such thing as overkill in home theater? And for the most part, my answer is no. Having more is a good thing, because just because you have more doesn't mean you always have to crank it and go to the extremes. You still need to dial it in. You still need to calibrate your system so that everything is balanced seamlessly and so that they all work together to produce an incredible sound in your home theater. Well, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Let me know down in the comments below. Do you think overkill is a such thing in home theater? And as always, you guys be blessed, and we'll catch you in the next video.